Three teenage girls vanished while hitchhiking to a nightclub. 75 days later, their bodies were found, and Spain would never forget their names. Desiree Hernandez Folch, Miriam Garcia Iborra, Antonia Toñi Gomez Rodriguez. Three girls from Alcácer, Valencia. Three friends whose disappearance on November 13, 1992, became one of the most notorious criminal cases in modern Spain. Not only because of the brutality, not only because of the two men tied to the case, Antonio Anglés and Miguel Ricard, but because decades later, one man has served prison time, one man is still missing, and 7 distinct hairs and DNA profiles were found that did not match the girls, Anglés or Ricard. This is the Alcácer case. On November 13th, 1992, Desiree, Miriam, and Toñi were teenagers with a simple plan. They were heading to a nightclub in Picassent. To get there, they were hitchhiking. That detail is the beginning of the case, and it matters. Because before the media storm, before the court proceedings, before the national obsession and the arguments over evidence, this began with something painfully ordinary. 3 girls trying to get from Alcácer to a nearby town for a night out. Alcácer is in Valencia, Spain. Picassent was close enough to be a destination, but not close enough for 3 teenagers to simply vanish without consequence. When Desiree, Miriam, and Toñi did not return, the night stopped being ordinary. Their absence became the first fact in a case that would consume families, investigators, journalists, and an entire country. For weeks there were no bodies, only names, only faces, only the growing realization that 3 teenage girls had disappeared while hitchhiking, and no explanation had arrived with the passing days. In true crime, there is often a moment when a missing persons case changes shape. At first, the public hopes for confusion, a misunderstanding, a delay, a runaway theory, anything that leaves room for survival. But time has a way of stripping those possibilities away. Day after day, the case becomes heavier. Silence becomes evidence of its own kind. From November 13th, 1992, until January 27, 1993, Spain waited with the families of Desiree, Miriam, and Toñi. Then, on January 27th, their bodies were found. The discovery ended the search for the girls, but it did not bring peace. It began the second life of the case, the one built around horror, investigation, accusation, and doubt. The Alcácer case became notorious in Spain because of the brutality inflicted on the victims. Even without repeating every detail, the public understanding of the crime was shaped by the fact that what happened to these girls was not simply murder. It was violence so severe that it marked the case permanently in national memory. But brutality was only one part of why Alcácer stayed in the public consciousness. The investigation itself was criticized. The media coverage was criticized. And over time, the case became more than a criminal file. It became a symbol of something darker, how a society responds when the victims are young, when the violence is extreme, and when the official story leaves questions behind. 2 names became central: Antonio Anglés, Miguel Ricard. The case involved both men, but their paths after the crime could not have been more different. Miguel Ricard was jailed. Antonio Anglés disappeared, and Anglés remains wanted. That split, one man imprisoned, one man gone, has shaped the public memory of the case for decades. Ricard became the man the justice system could hold. Anglés became the fugitive the system could not. In many criminal cases, a conviction or imprisonment creates a sense of closure, even if it is painful. Alcácer did not work that way. Ricard going to prison did not stop the questions. Anglais disappearing did not fade into the background. Instead, his absence became part of the mystery. A wanted man who vanishes does not simply leave a case. He leaves a shadow over it. And in the Alcácer case, that shadow has never completely lifted. The facts that remain are stark. 3 teenage girls disappeared on November 13th, 1992. They were hitchhiking to a nightclub in Picassent. Their bodies were found on January 27, 1993. The case involved Antonio Anglais and Miguel Ricard. Ricard was jailed. Anglais disappeared and remains wanted. And then there is the evidence that continues to disturb the case's final shape. 7 distinct hairs and DNA profiles did not match the girls, Anglais or Ricard. That is not rumor. That is one of the facts that keeps the case unsettled. 7 distinct profiles, not matching the victims, not matching Anglais, not matching Ricard. By itself, that does not automatically prove a complete, alternate version of the crime. Unmatched biological material can raise questions without answering them. It can point to unidentified people without proving exactly how or when that material arrived. But in a case already criticized for its investigation, those 7 profiles became impossible to ignore. Because when the official picture of a case centers on known individuals, unmatched traces challenge the edges of that picture. Who were they from? Why were they there? Why did they not match the 3 girls or the 2 men most associated with the case? Those questions have followed Alcácer for years. The criticism of the investigation matters because the strength of any criminal case depends on trust. Trust that evidence was handled correctly, that leads were followed, that assumptions were tested, and that conclusions came from facts rather than pressure. When an investigation is criticized, the public does not only question what investigators found, it begins to question what may have been missed. In Alcácer, the stakes of that criticism were enormous. The victims were children in the eyes of the country, teenagers whose lives had been cut off violently. The public wanted answers, but it also wanted those answers to be solid. Instead, the case became surrounded by argument. Some people focused on Ricard's imprisonment. Some focused on Anglais and his disappearance. Others focused on the unmatched hairs and DNA profiles. And many focused on the way the case was presented to the public. The media coverage became part of the scandal. The crime was horrifying, but the way it was discussed, displayed and consumed, added another layer of damage. Alcácer did not remain only in courtrooms or police files. It entered homes across Spain through coverage that was later heavily criticized. That is part of why the case remains so infamous. The victims were not allowed to be only victims. Their story became a national spectacle. Their names were repeated. Their faces were shown. Their suffering became a subject of public debate, speculation, and attention. And for many people in Spain, the Alcácer case became a turning point in how they thought about crime, television, journalism, and the limits of public curiosity. True crime always walks close to that line. To tell a story like this responsibly, the focus has to stay on what is known. Desiree Hernández Folch, Miriam Garcia Iborra, and Antonia Toñi Gómez Rodriguez were real girls. They were not symbols first. They were not headlines first. They were daughters, friends, teenagers from Alcácer who left for Picassent on November 13th, 1992, and never came home. Everything after that, the suspects, the prison sentence, the fugitive, the evidence, the media storm, exists because their lives were taken. The case's power comes from the collision between certainty and uncertainty. There is certainty in the date they disappeared. There is certainty in the destination, a nightclub in Picasso. There is certainty in the date their bodies were found, January 27th, 1993. There is certainty that the case involved Antonio Anglés and Miguel Ricard. There is certainty that Ricard was jailed. There is certainty that Anglés disappeared and remains wanted. There is certainty that 7 distinct hairs and DNA profiles did not match the girls, Anglés or Ricard. But certainty stops before the questions do. That is what makes Alcácer different from cases that end cleanly in the public mind. Even with a man jailed, the case does not feel fully sealed. Even with names attached to it, the unmatched profiles remain. Even with decades of attention, Anglés remains absent, and absence is powerful. A missing suspect becomes a place where theories gather. A criticized investigation becomes a place where distrust grows. Unmatched forensic traces become a place where unanswered questions survive. Together, they keep the Alcácer case open in public memory, even if legal proceedings reach their own conclusions. For Spain, the case was more than a crime. It was a rupture. It exposed fear about the safety of young women, anger over brutality, concern about investigative failures, and discomfort with the way media can transform private grief into public consumption. The story began with 3 girls hitchhiking to a nightclub. It became a national trauma. And at the center of it are still 3 names that should never be reduced to evidence or controversy: Desiree, Miriam, Tony. Their disappearance on November 13, 1992, and the discovery of their bodies on January 27, 1993, created one of Spain's most infamous true crime cases. The brutality made it unforgettable. The criticized investigation made it divisive. The media coverage made it notorious. Ricard's imprisonment gave the case one legal answer. Anglés' disappearance left another answer missing. And the 7 unmatched hairs and DNA profiles left a question that has never stopped echoing. Who do those 7 unmatched hairs and DNA profiles belong to? For more cases told with care, follow Whispered Cases.